So our facilitator is Dr. Natalie Ma, who is a synthetic biologist and also biotech entrepreneur that has quite a good number of years of experience in building biotech companies from Novatech to good at the bedside and beyond. She is passionate about experimenting, learning, creating, and ensuring humanity's survival on and off planet. And she was head of business development at Felix Biotech, a company developing products using phage therapy. So during the pandemic, she spoke quite a bit about how biotech companies were affected by the pandemic, and I'm hoping we can have a bit of experience on that so that going forward, we know how to equip the private sector to be ready to respond to such unseen circumstances that have potential to cause massive danger. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming Dr. Natalie Ma to facilitate a session on response to GCBRs experience from the private industry. Dr. Natalie.
But I wanted to ask you to do this mostly as a motivator for why are we trying to engage industry, right? So you have a ton of powers in policy, in governance, but there is a huge amount of sort of power, inertia, capability in industry that you also want to engage when you face a global catastrophic biological risk or a global catastrophic risk of any kind. And so when I started thinking about the question of what to talk about, Ian prompted me of, talk about your experience in private industry. I started thinking about, what kind of framework is there to engage industry on this? And I realized maybe the best framework is from industry. And this is just sort of an outline of it. And you might recognize this is some very basic questions, like open-ended, what, who, when, where, how, and why questions that we'll go through in this presentation. And I want to just call out here, this is definitely a work. As you go through this framework, ask yourself, what could be missing from this? What could we add to it to make it better? What could we take away from it to make it better? But starting out, the first thing is, what is this? This is essentially a framework to engage private industry. And the main thing I want to call out is this is what we do in startups. So I spend most of my time finding problems, talking to experts about why those problems exist and pulling apart what exactly those problems are, and then figuring out solutions to actually solve or address those problems in exchange for money. And the entirety of private industry is doing this, right? You're providing some sort of value, being a resource or good, a service, something in exchange for money. And so this framework is what we do with startups. We send startups to go talk to 100 people, and it is legitimately talk to 100 people and figure out what their market is, what the problem is that they're facing. And in the same way, you can use this to engage private industry to understand, how are they going to respond to a global catastrophic biological risk? How are they going to respond to something like a pandemic? And the really sort of your end goal is, how are we going to operate in this situation? Again, I've used the word pandemic here because it's our closest analogy. So who should be participating in this framework? I've highlighted sort of 3 people here. It's always less lonely to work on a team. But essentially, it's someone who understands how the money flows, right? How is money being transferred from one place to another? How is it flowing from government in response? If a GCBR happens, how is that going to flow out into private industry, to individual people? Here in the US, there has been a huge response in terms of pandemic response loans, and that have kept businesses afloat essentially during the pandemic, provided you didn't lay anyone off. You also want someone who I think broadly understands biomedical research. And I put biomedical in parentheses here, because I think you could have someone who understands research very well as well, but the biomedical component of it is important because GCBRs are inherently going to have a biological component to them. So having someone with expertise there is critical. And then the last person who should be involved is someone who understands the process to make decisions in your country, in the region, even at individual people level, right? It's like, how are these decisions going to get made by individuals, by local governments, and so forth? So let me pause there before we jump into the next slide and see if there are any questions. Okay, when is the best time to use this framework? Before the GCBR, before the pandemic. Since we had COVID-19 as the training ground for GCBRs, I think I don't need to dwell on the chaos that we had as a result of that. Some countries' responses were better than others. Some of them, even at the regional level, some regions' responses were better than others. But I think one of the critical things is starting this and having an understanding of how private industry is going to respond to a global catastrophic risk before you have the global catastrophic risk, right? And sort of to Ian's point around the question of, what can private industry offer? We can only offer things or be prepared to offer things if we thought about it. Realistically, a lot of the lives of folks in private industry, people who are leading companies, are very tied up in what needs to happen day to day, which is I need to hire X number of people for our company to grow. I need to make sure that we are compliant with these regulations. I need to make sure that our sales are growing X amount so that we're able to hit our next milestones and make our next funding. So to fit into private industry and get them aware, you have to engage them in some way and have them thinking about the question. There are certain industry leaders that I think are more, so groups like Ginkgo Bioworks have been thinking about this for a very long time. And I know folks there, I think that they've done some really great work. But for the majority of people, that sort of biosecurity awareness is not something that's top of mind because they have 100 other things to worry about in private industry. Now, in terms of like what you have in your pandemic and or GCBR preparedness response, right? It's like, what can you engage private industry in? This sort of stretches across all aspects of society. And again, we can talk a little bit about sort of the biological aspects of this, the biomedical or biotech aspects of it. But I've just sort of built this framework here to sort of help us think about all the sort of categories of resources available. And they fall into two big categories. You have people. So you have the personnel, the individual humans, all living within the affected region or country. And then you have actual physical materials of some kind, goods, equipment, and so forth. And then they sort of fall into three concentric circles, things that are sort of essential for the response to the pandemic or specific global catastrophic biological risk, right? And again, I know we've talked about us being totally unable to anticipate where the GCBR is going to come from or what exactly it will look like. But I think that we shouldn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and you can get a pretty good idea of what it might look like just based on understanding of biology, right? In terms of threats, we were aware that this family of coronaviridie was, I think it was identified as the top 5 viruses that would cause an issue because they would become a global pandemic because of its high mutation rate as an RNA virus and its frequent zoonotic transmissions, jumps between animals and humans that had already happened with SARS and MERS. So this wasn't totally out of the blue. The upside was, I mean, if you look at what happened with the vaccine response, we didn't start from scratch with the vaccine. So BioNTech had already started working on a MERS vaccine before COVID-19 happened. In fact, a couple of companies had done this. And so when COVID-19 happened, they had been doing that as a side project. It was mostly because they had funding from a defense agency, so a national government for an award for this. And they dusted all of that off and got working on it because they realized this is the same family of virus. So that puts you light years ahead already. And I think is a good illustration of this is why you should be funding private industry to be looking to some extent at GCBRs, because you can start incentivizing some of this preparedness before the pandemic, before the GCBR happens. So in terms of categories, pandemic and then essential. And what I mean by essential here is we're talking about entities that are essential for function in society, right? These are the core services or goods, things that need to happen no matter what to keep people alive in the society. And then the third category is sort of non-essential. So we'll go through these sort of three categories and how to sort of interact with them to understand these aspects of private industry and how they can help respond to a GCBR. So let's sort of talk about what is essential to respond to the GCBR, that first circle, the innermost circle. Again, even not knowing what that GCBR is going to look like, here we have on the left, the personnel broadly who I imagine would be the people that you would want. The first of them are medical staff, right? So GCBR is going to attack, be it people, and it's going to eventually boil down to, so even in the case you had an agricultural thing, you would have probably health effects of that, right? And so they're going to be critical to this. Testing staff, so you need to figure out what's wrong and how does this threat work, right? So they're going to be a set of staff that are core and working directly on this problem. Community leaders are critical, and I think this was super underlooked in the pandemic. It's probably not really considered a business, but I believe like most institutions, even nonprofits and like religious organizations are entities that are within the private sector that have a lot to contribute because they are trusted, right? And you want to understand, what their incentives are as well to get them involved in any kind of GCBR response. And then public health and contact tracers. So it's like, how is this thing transmitting or moving? Even in a world where we're not dealing with, let's say we're dealing with a GCBR that is not a human health threat. So an agricultural threat or pest, right? You still would need somebody to do some kind of contact tracing, someone that's moving, someone at the same time that risks transmitting the thing, that is aware and understanding of the risks that they are taking and the procedures to mitigate those risks. And the questions that you want to be asking are sort of these questions. These are just examples, but who are they and how do they operate, right? What is it that they need to work and what would block them from working? Because one of the things that we saw in the pandemic was so much in the hospital system, which in the US are often in the private sector, grind to a halt because of resource limitations. Just didn't have enough ventilators, right? And so it was this insane problem where we couldn't get more ventilators. You literally can't manufacture more overnight. And the medical staff were like, we don't know what else we can do except starting to decide who lives and who dies, right? And then that sort of flows into the next part, which is here on the other side, you have materials. So again, from the pandemic perspective, things like personal protective equipment and sanitizer are critical to sort of contain a GCBR, right? Like this is something required from medical staff, for testing staff, for anyone who's interacting with anyone potentially infectious or potentially infectious or contaminated area. The other thing is lab reagents and equipment. This was something nobody had really thought about, surprisingly, when we ended up in the pandemic, but we started running out of PCR reagents, right? And so many tests were being run on the COVID-19 virus, and a lot of them were PCR based, that we were running out of some of the just mundane like reagents that would go into the PCR reaction. This was one of them. Polymerase is literally the protein that makes DNA strands in the PCR reaction that we then detect to tell whether or not the virus is present. Running short on that. Some of, like I said, the reagents, I can't remember the exact reagent's name. Ask me about it after and I'll find you the link. But we were literally running out of that because there weren't that many companies making it beforehand. It turns out when you go from needing, let's say, 100 units or 100 bottles of this year to suddenly 10,000 bottles of this stuff a year, a company can't just go and make that. So seeing where those things are coming from and then going to those groups, right? And asking, okay, well, what happens if I suddenly need 100 times more gloves? What happens if we suddenly need 40 times more of this reagent? Like how quickly and how flexibly can you move to fill that need? And then the third thing is information sharing. And I highlight this as a resource because we tend to think of it as metaphysical, But realistically, it relies on things like having up-to-date computers and networks, right? Up-to-date ways to reach people, whether that's by mobile phone, whether that's by app, whether that's by a community computer in regions that don't have full computer and internet access, right? And so for all of these things, you're asking, how much of it do we as a country or region have? How much are we going to need? And that is concentric, right? So like you can imagine a single region being affected by a GCBR that you're trying to contain or address before it becomes the true global risk, to an entire country in a pandemic situation where it's already spread everywhere and you're working across regions to try and contain and mitigate the damage. Where can we get these from? What happens if supply is disrupted, right? And so one of the things that happened was we couldn't get enough gloves or masks in the pandemic. And early on, there was a huge argument over whether N95 masks should be going to the general public versus giving them to doctors, right, who were at the front lines in the hospitals. And I have a friend who is a physician, and literally we started figuring out, can you sterilize the N95s? How do you sterilize them? And they had worked out a way where they could expose them to UV in under a PCR hood. You have these hoods in labs. They're used for a totally different purpose, but you want them to be clean and sterile. So they emit ultraviolet light that kills everything, all the bacteria. And we throw the N95s into them and then test them and be like, okay, that actually works. So there's a way for us to reuse these if supply is disrupted. And then I think the hardest question is, if this is going to be needed elsewhere, how are we going to allocate it? And I got to this a little bit earlier with, you have a zero-sum game that in many places you will be fighting where multiple entities, be it pandemic or essential services, need a resource. How are you going to allocate that and play that game? And you won't know how to do that until you see how much of it people are routinely using and what they need in private industry. So pause there really quickly. Any questions before we move on to the next concentric question?
Yes, we are in the same page indeed. I am completely agree with you that the leaders or the community leaders by this description is very important and have the great impact on the society and to respond to the catastrophic effect. But if this is the case, what about the policymakers? Because also we should consider the policymaker as a people to get, I think they are very essential in the response.
Yeah. 100%. So when I put this framework together, I imagine the policymakers as the people running around on the ground doing this. So they are the people asking the questions in this case and building all of these bridges, right? It's people in government, people in policy, because they're the ones who are planning for this before it happens. Like I said, private industry, a lot of us are focusing on the day-to-day and keeping our companies afloat. So they are the key stars, I'd say, in this, in making sure this framework and a framework to respond to a GCBR is in place before it happens, ideally.
Yes, great. My second question regarding the material, I have 2 points here. The first point is that the sampling, I missing the sampling in the material, and this is very essential indeed. What's your opinion?
So you mean sampling for a variety, before you go into testing, is that correct?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so I had sort of broadly categorized these. We could add a sampling category, but I sort of thought about it as a lab reagent. So for example, lab reagent equipment would be the entire kit for COVID, right? So if you look at COVID, you have the nylon brush, and those ended up being in shortage for a while as well. That directly actually impacted a project I ended up doing where we had to give all the nylon brushes away because it was more important to test for COVID than it was to do our microbiome study. So that if you put that in that category, we can also definitely call it out though. And I just want to say, if you're taking notes right now directly on what's on the slides, you don't have to worry about it because I'm going to send these slides to Ian right afterward, and you will have full access to them to add that category yourself to review them however much you want.
Yes, great. I asking this question because I am thinking like that. We are working on the framework, focusing on the sharing of both the sampling and information and data. So I focus on this because we are already working on this framework. Okay, that's great. The second point is that I also found you missing the countermeasure regarding the material, missing the countermeasure like vaccines and drugs. And they're very essential.
They are essential. This assumes we do not yet have them. So this assumes a risk that we don't know how to respond to yet. I'm going to get to medicines in the next thing. We can, if you imagine a world in which we have a response to a GCBR, you could add that to this list. In the case of COVID, we did not have this. We just had palliative care. One other thing I would say here is like, we'll get into this in terms of like logistics and transport, but the way the U.S. has set up its sort of medical countermeasures program, we have like essentially depots across the U.S. where things are placed. We had, as part of that PPE, if I remember correctly, and while we had the storage, implementation or distribution of this became super challenging because it wasn't clear from the beginning who was going to get what, sort of like going to this point. So I think if we were to add this question of, if you have a medical countermeasure in place, who is going to get it and where is it going to go becomes an even more critical question, right? So I 100% agree with you on both of those points, and those are categories we can definitely add to this.
Thank you.
Awesome. I'm going to move a little quickly through the next set of slides just so we can hopefully keep us on time.
There's one more question, Natalie. One more question here.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Okay. Thank you, Natalie, for above your speak. You have said above the pandemic, COVID has changed many things. For example, the use of vaccination before the end of clinical trial. Do you think this cannot do something about the biosecurity of the patient? Because we don't have enough data for use of the vaccine.
Oh, that's a hard question. So like essentially that's a question of risk, right? It's like how much risk are we willing to take on the safety of something before we distribute it widely. And that risk profile has changed over time. So I mean, if you look at the original smallpox vaccine, so this is known as ACAM2000 in the US, it is actually a live vaccinia virus. It's terrible is the short answer. So the risk profile on that is it will give people who are immunocompromised pretty horrific disease. It will abort fetuses in pregnant women. It will flake off in people with skin disorders and transmit itself to other people. It is basically a vaccine you would not really want to give to anyone writ large, right? And yet we stockpile huge doses of this in the US because for the majority of the population, that risk profile is something we would be willing to take in the event of a smallpox attack, right? And so here's an example of a GCBR where we have a response, and actually we know the risks and they're terrible, but we've decided that, based on what's available to us today, we are going to use this only in case of emergency, but we stopped vaccinating the broader population. Now, the question that you get to, which is, how do you handle this in the absence of information, is a really challenging one that I don't think that as science or even private industry can answer on its own. It is, we can provide data in clinic, right? We can provide clinical trials. And I mean, some of the most amazing things in the last 10 years, I'd say, are watching clinical trials evolve from your standard 2-arm randomized blinded placebo-controlled trial to more adaptive strategies. This has been driven by both oncology studies, studies of cancer, as well as studies for Ebola, right? Looking at ring vaccination to see whether or not vaccination is effective. And those, I think, are ways we can get the data and buy down, some of that uncertainty without having, and then allowing us to sort of make a decision, right? So to sort of sidestep your question, in a place where you don't have any information, you can't make an informed decision. But there are strategies for us to get information more effectively than there were even 10 years ago. And there will be better strategies to get information like this around risk of using something as well as versus risk of disease as we go forward in the next 10 years. The second category, hopefully moving through this a little more quickly to keep you all on time, is, what's essential to survival / minimize human suffering during this whole period. I think that we all saw sort of the response to the pandemic. It was various. Actually, I think that it's also incredibly varied. Some of the countries had a much better time than others, but at least in the US, it was in many places a near total shutdown. It became a question of who is considered essential. And I think I've highlighted sort of the critical question here, which is who to move around to do their job. And at the bottom, deciding who is essential before the pandemic, because private industry is highly motivated to generate revenue, continue working, right? And so you had situations of very sort of perverse incentives here in the US where once there was a call that went out like, oh, you are considered essential if you meet these 3 criteria, there were tons of companies who were like, yes, we meet these key criteria, you should make us essential, we should be allowed to go into work, when they should not have been allowed to go into work. This wasn't critical for the pandemic response. So deciding that in advance is a great way to get around that. But essentially, here are a few categories of people that I would consider important to go ask questions of, right? It's like, what do you need to do your jobs? Like, what's going to happen if there is a blocker? Things like medical support staff became a huge issue. Infrastructure and maintenance became a huge issue. Like, how are you going to keep things running? And a lot of this is predicated on, you have a group of people here responding to the pandemic. What do they need to survive, right? They don't operate in isolation. And your category of materials also grows. So one of the big problems that we had here in the US was there were tons of medical staff responding to COVID, getting COVID, and then there was not enough staff to actually help people to routine things or more concerning needs. You had patients who were essentially not able to get help or dying, not because they had COVID, because hospitals were overwhelmed. A second problem we had was that people wouldn't come into clinic. So they needed care, but they were afraid to come get care, right? And so it's like, how do you distribute medicines to people who need them when they're not going to come into clinic, right? How are you going to get these resources to people when essentially you're shutting down a region or an entire country to respond to a global catastrophic biological risk? I'm going to jump to the next slide really quickly. I'm sure there'll be questions on that slide as well, but I wanted to get to this one really because there is also a key role for what I call non-essential people to play in this pandemic. And a lot of this, I think, was a cause of a lot of problems and challenges in this current pandemic because we didn't have a clear idea of what could these people do. They are from a range of industries. I think the biggest takeaway here, looking at sort of the questions, is what would motivate them to minimize their risk and continue to engage them, because you have a group of people in this situation who want to do things, who want to be helpful. So in the U.S., because we didn't have enough testing capacity, we actually had graduate students who were trained in biology. They're not diagnostics technicians, but they essentially self-organized into a lab and started taking COVID samples from local communities to supplement testing capacity. And so being aware of, what do these people do and how much you'd be able to plug in during a pandemic, during a global catastrophic biological risk. How could you actually help, right? We had people who were just knitting things or making cards, which you think of as rather maybe silly or frivolous, but it kept them occupied. And those things then flowed to people who were working really hard in the community and helped them feel valued. Like, all of these 23-hour work days that they were doing, there was value in that. Someone was recognizing it. And I think those are sort of some of the success stories of the pandemic, which we tend to sort of, I think, sometimes write off as feel-good stories and not sort of celebrate enough. But if we're social creatures, like the ability to participate in some way helps all of the people who cannot do anything feel like they have a semblance of power, and then at the same time motivate them to actually comply and follow the rules that enable us to essentially defeat a GCBR pandemic sooner. In the same way, you had a range of goods that could be repurposed. So, there are a lot of things in personal care and cosmetics that are like a form of sanitizer. You can repurpose those. We had people that were cutting apart clothes to make masks. And another thing I want to highlight here is like entertainment activities. if this is a short GCBR risk, which, there have been some biological risks that have been very short in duration because they're limited attacks. But if it's a GCBR, chances are we're in it for a while. This is like a month, years thing. What entertainment activities can be done safely, right? And this was something that was a huge front topic at the beginning of the Are there contactless ways to deliver these kinds of things? Keep some, again, anchor of normalcy and normal life for all of the people in the population, including the people who are responding as essential, including the people who are working directly on the pandemic. So let me pause there really quickly. I know that we're over time, but we'll take any questions. But overall, oh, actually, I do have one more slide. Hold on, I'll take questions after the last two slides. Another thing that we didn't really focus enough on was what happens after the pandemic, right? It's what can industry do to contribute? And as a policymaker, what can you think about to help return to pre-pandemic or pre-GCBR baseline, right? It's essentially what you're experiencing as a society as a collective trauma. This is something I don't think happened super well for COVID because nobody had any experience in it, but we're figuring out when are we done? When are we deciding this is normal, even if it's never fully normal, what's needed for recovery and how long it's going to take to recover is critical. And the why, right here is the better we prepare, the more quickly we recover from a pandemic or a GCBR, which I don't think I need to tell anyone in this room because you're already here motivated to help tackle this problem. So hopefully that gave you an idea of the industry overall and how you could get them to plug into a global catastrophic biological risk. My contact information is here, and I'll hand these slides over to Ian afterward. And my asks for you are, as the wonderful people with questions who've already chimed in, what are your thoughts? How would you improve or change this? Was it useful? And what can you take from it to implement in pandemic or GCBR preparedness? So I'll pause there, take any questions, and thank you again for the time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Natalie, for that wonderful session.